Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Barry Posen. Barry Posen is a Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT and the Director of MIT Security Studies Program. He is known as one of the leading experts on U.S. grand strategy, military doctrine, and international security policy. His distinguished career includes several acclaimed books on U.S. grand strategy, and his research has shaped debates on American foreign policy and military strategy. Dr. Posen's accolades include the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, a fellowship in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards in security studies. Professor Posen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Professor Posen, for being with us today. It's a real pleasure to have someone who's kind of seen the sweep of things over the last couple of decades. And, you know, I've had a chance to kind of go back to your manuscript on Restraint, and I wonder, do you see yourself as having sketched out where things eventually went in American foreign policy? Or, you know, should we be looking at that kind of more acutely to see where things went wrong? How would you say?
Well, I guess, I mean, the book, which is now quite a few years old, has a assessment of, you know, sort of what I think was going on in the world, and then some prescriptions about how the United States should adapt. And essentially, you know, I saw power in the world diffusing. I saw the rise of China. I saw the increasing capabilities of middle powers, which would make American exercise in military force more costly. And so my view was that U.S. grand strategy needed to change, needed to adapt. That's why I recommended the strategy of restraint, which was not original to me. I imbibed many of the ideas from Harvey Sapolsky, who was my predecessor at SSP, and, you know, title tells all. So I think my diagnosis of how the world was moving was pretty good. The prescription, what we managed to do was put a policy alternative on the table. But I can't say that I see either the Democrats under President Biden or the Republicans, either, you know, in Trump's first administration or the current administration, really following that route. I just think we managed to interject another position in a U.S. debate that was very, very homogeneous and in many ways self-satisfied.
Oh, well, you know, I would be interested, you know, just to kind of take a look at the broad scope of, you know, the tariff policy that the president has advanced. Do you think that, you know, there's an element of kind of strategic thinking in terms of, you know, trying to reclaim this vast kind of trading space as something the United States can dominate? You know, one piece of your work that I read with great interest a while ago was, you know, controlling the commons, and I wonder whether, you know, you could analogize the oceans to kind of the vast trading system. Is that a far flung analogy, or?
I think, you know, command of the commons was about then U.S. Really domination of sea, space, and to some extent air. And with the general diffusion of power, that's become much harder to achieve. So I think space dominance with a big D is probably not achievable. The areas where we have air dominance have shrunk, but I think we still have basically a very high degree of military influence over the commons. And given that that's, you know, the sea, given that that's the principal avenue for international trade, the United States military hegemony serves as a kind of enabler of globalization in the same way that, you know, British sea power did. Analogizing to trade, I feel like I'm always walking on sand when I venture into discussions of trade, because it's not really something I've paid a lot of attention to. But my I would say intuition based on some things I've picked up from colleagues over the years is that trade kind of finds a way, and it's not an easy space to dominate. Not only is it lots of countries find ways to make money out of it, but once we've created a safe commons, it's hard for us to then turn that safety on and off without making ourselves the enemy of everybody, right? So it's kind of hard to really put the hammer down unless you're in a war, right? Now, as far as using tariff policy, if I believe that the president really had a pretty well worked out strategy, I'd be more inclined to say, yeah, maybe. What I sense, though, is that the president has a kind of impression, right? And the impression is that the free trade system has allowed others to rise. I don't think he has a strong view or a well-researched view on whether they would have risen anyway, maybe a little more slowly, maybe not as far, but it's allowed others to rise. And the Americans have left themselves pretty open as far as trading is concerned because of a kind of a general concern for, sort of the benefits of free trade for us, but also because of expectations about its benefits for the system. And the benefits for the system in terms of, getting other countries to moderate their behavior and follow our lead, et cetera, et cetera. Those are quite diffuse, right? And many of those who are advocates of that, of globalization, in particular, the liberal hegemony, was all about there's going to be this future, this great future where competition is going to wane and we're all going to benefit from that. And my guess is, trying to channel President Trump, is he says, this is a long time coming. He's tapping his watch and basically saying, I want to see some gains that I understand and that he thinks he can explain to his followers. I don't think it's going to work out all that well for the average American. There are some things in that huge bundle that probably we should pay more attention to, friendshoring or onshoring. But on the whole, free trade has been pretty good for the consumer, maybe not for the producer. And, we Americans have a right to ask that question, and we should think about it. But my concern over the president's trade policy is that it's a bit incoherent, even if it's driven by, a concern about, what theorists call relative gains and what it does for our power position in the world.
I want to back up a minute. How would you describe President Trump's foreign policy right now? We were talking before we started recording that basically he campaigned on things like non-intervention, but then takes office and does not necessarily follow through on that. How would you describe his foreign policy? And have you been surprised so far in the first year of the second term?
Well, I'll do what academics do. I'll take my right arm and put it around to my back and feverishly start patting it. And I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, maybe it was in the middle of the first Trump administration, in which I dubbed his grand strategy illiberal hegemony, right? I think in the first administration, President Trump came in talking a good game about his focus on America, but I think he kind of quickly came to, if not understand in some comprehensive sense, I think he came to a belief or an insight that being the top dog in the world was kind of fun, as long as you control the exchange in every transaction and who won and who lost. So what I think he tried to do was maintain America's preeminence, but to profit from it in a short-term and obvious way. And doing that required already riding roughshod over things like free trade, the United Nations, the views of some of our allies on this, that, and the other, right? So he liked the number one part of it, and he didn't mind wielding power. It was the uh, the um, the exchange aspects of it, where where under the old system, it didn't seem like we were, in his terms, winning. Right, others seemed to be winning, or at least getting a draw. Right, so I guess as I've tried to wrestle with understanding the current direction of the strategy, I find myself returning to that article and asking, is that still an adequate description of the Trump administration? And I would say yes and no. And the no part is do I need another modifier, in other words, even more illiberal hegemony, or even more hegemonic illiberalism? Now, why these terms don't matter very much to most people, but the main point is that he's much more aggressive, much more unconstrained, and in some ways this is one of these bad news, good news things. He's benefiting from the fact that allies when he first was president, they were concerned about threats from abroad and they wanted to keep America on side, but they could get away with kind of giving a little. They're now more scared of their own environment, so they're much more interested in keeping the president happy. And the president has made clear that he's harder to keep happy, right? So the bargains he's driving are much harder this time around. And they're much more nakedly power relations, right? And I guess I am surprised by that, but I probably shouldn't have been. I think people who understood Trump world better than I did, because I'm not in that world, would have understood that the voices of the Republican voices, even hawkish conservative ones, of the past, American grand strategy in the past, had themselves been some kind of break on the Trump administration in the first term, and now they're just not around, right? He staffed it with loyalists, right? So he's free to follow his instincts. So his instincts have not changed very much, but I think the environment, in some ways, partly because of his own creation, which is building his own followership to staff the administration, and partly because allies are scared and are more willing to appease him, I think he's actually much less constrained.
I want to talk a bit about allies. I think a lot of folks...
Allies. Allies.
Yeah. Yes. A lot of people think that our allies in the past didn't step up enough, including President Trump, who has famously called on them to spend more on defense. I think you've called for similar things. Do you think that President Trump's threatening of our European allies in particular is paying off? Could someone not give him kudos and credit for getting them to step up and to play a bigger role on the global stage?
I guess I think there's two actors who get the credit. One is President Trump and one is Vladimir Putin. And the combination provides quite the impetus to Europeans to develop some capacity to look after themselves. Even given those two causes, I would say that Europeans are still a bit dilatory. I mean, they're doing much better, and I'm glad they are. But and I think both Trump and Putin get some credit for that. But I think they should do even more. And in a weird way, I think we've gotten to the point where I think we're President Trump has to decide what he really wants, right? And my impression is he wants them to do more, but he actually doesn't want them to be very self-reliant. He likes having others on the string, on the dangle, right? And if I were a European right now, I'd be working much harder to really develop truly autonomous capabilities, and not working quite so hard in the hopes that if you kiss Trump's ring often enough and provide enough presence, that you can keep this relationship together. My own view, based not on very good understanding of American politics is it doesn't really matter what you can get people to say in polls. I think Americans' general interest in foreign policy is much less than it was in the past. I think the foreign policy establishment, what's left of it, is busy trying to scare the hell out of them to get them to be more supportive of this, that, and the other. But I just get the impression, and this is, again, me, East Coast, Northeast, academic, all the rarefied descriptors matter. But, my nose tells me that they're not all that interested, right? And this puts our allies more at the whim of a single leader than I think they've been in many, many decades. And if I were a nation state's leader, I would say to myself, this is not sustainable. And Europe, plus or minus, they have the wealth, they have the population, they have the technology, they have the military building blocks. They could, on the whole, they could look after themselves if they really wanted to. And I think they're buying more insurance than they once did, but to my eye, still not enough.
Fascinating. I'd love to jump in here and ask a little bit about kind of the historical, period before kind of our current set of issues. And I, as I mentioned before, I'm doing some research on kind of decisions the U.S. made in the 1990s. And, I'm fascinated by some of the theories that came out about what the U.S. should do after the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, I think we have foundational books like After Victory by Eikenberry, which kind of describes how there should be this kind of constitutional order put forward. But I wonder, do you think there's any one particular blaring error from the 1990s that we should be thinking about in terms of its causal links to, the present and issues we're facing now? Or is that, too big of a leap to make in terms of our assumptions? What do you think?
I think our reach exceeded our grasp and did so in ways that were somewhat predictable. And I think we paid a pretty significant price, right? There's different ways you could kind of describe this, and in some ways, I think you want to talk to a bigger thinker than I am actually to talk about it. But my simple explanation at the time was that we were kind of drunk on two things. One was power. We had way more of the sinews and muscle of power than any other country in the world had ever had. And therefore, the world was open to our activities. Not open in a welcoming sense, but just open because we could give lots of things a try. And second, the good guys won the Cold War and the bad guys didn't, right? So the good guys were the liberal democracies and the bad guys were the totalitarians. Everybody famous in these conversations, everyone does the air quotes and mentions end of history and Frank Fukuyama's discussion, right? But we believed that this was the moment to establish the U.S.-led rules, norms-based liberal world order, which Eikenberry, in his more candid moments, would admit should be called liberal hegemony, right? And as I describe it in my book, we were active everywhere, right? Shouldn't act everywhere, but active in many places, urging transformation, coercing transformation, bribing transformation. When we faced military pushback, fighting against those who dared to oppose transformation. We treated other idea systems for how to organize politics, especially nationalist ethnic ones, as kind of, brain illnesses left from the 19th century that could be extirpated once and for all. And whatever, Nostrum liberalism prescribed, regardless of, the creative destruction aspects of it, including spreading the market everywhere as quickly as possible and opening up everything you could open up and deregulating America and opening the internet, all this stuff, right? There was, this sounds strange coming from me because it's not what I do, but there was a deficit of conservatism, small c conservatism. And what I mean by that is liberals needed to take a breath and consolidate, right? Consolidate gains before jumping off to a new set of adventures. And we didn't understand, because I count myself in that group, we didn't understand the fragility of the moment. We thought that the moment was etched in stone, right? And also didn't see, as the United States began to get into misadventures that cost us dearly, and promoted illiberalism at home. You can't go anywhere without going through a security detector. And this is not America, right? We didn't realize and stop and think what it was doing to us, right? And so that's what I think was the big error.
Right. Well, I mean, if I could put a sort of finer point on it, you've intervened in I think the discussion about the war in Ukraine very powerfully and advanced, arguments that I think have forced people to look at their assumptions. For example, that, Russia has in fact undertaken the logic of preventative war, and that there is a way to understand its invasion of Ukraine that lines up with a rational interpretation of kind of shifting power dynamics. And I wonder, I also think there's been so much emphasis placed on NATO's expansion. Do you think that there's been a sort of a blind spot about how nuclear weapons were treated in the 1990s, and perhaps Russia saw opportunities given the West's kind of withdrawal of nuclear arms and the desire of the West to denuclearize the former Soviet republics as they became independent? Do you think there's an element of that nuclear change in the 1990s that in some ways allowed Russia to become more disinhibited?
Nah, not really. I think there's a deeper story here, which is nuclear weapons change international politics fundamentally, right? And not everyone agrees with this. Not everyone buys into every element of it. But if great powers were perfectly rational, they would understand that they actually don't have that much to fight about anymore. But they're not perfectly rational. And it's also the case that even in the nuclear age, you don't like your potential enemies nesting on your border, right? So, I don't think the Russians have treated nuclear weapons all that differently from the way we treat them or anybody else treats them who's got them, which is to say, anybody who's actually contemplating, invading my country really ought to think twice. The costs are very, very high, right? So, to me, there's nothing that much new about, the Russians, wielding a nuclear deterrent threat in the course of this war and saying to NATO, you watch your step, mind your P's and Q's. But, did somehow our choice to try and, limit the forward role of nuclear weapons in international politics, to control proliferation, to lower numbers, did this embolden the Russians in some way? I don't think so, right? I think there are some people who could make that argument. Who would make that argument, but it requires additional links in the chain, right? You'd have had to not only maintain nuclear weapons as sort of the front end of NATO's strategy, you'd have had to figure out a way to absorb the countries to which you wanted to extend deterrence and draw into your alliance system, you would have had to have done that very precipitously while Russia was extremely weak. And I know Ukraine probably thinks it would have been better off had that occurred, but I think it might have simply accelerated Russia's general disgruntlement with the trends in international politics, and their reaction would have come out in some other way. Right? Now, if you want to talk about, the state of the American nuclear weapons establishment and some other things, that's a separate expert question, and there are some issues there.
Fair enough. No, I completely understand. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I want to talk just a touch more about Ukraine, of course. How should the U.S. calibrate its support for Ukraine without risking direct confrontation with Russia right now? And does the conflict that we're seeing today reinforce your arguments for sort of greater restraint and reliance on your European security?
Well, the problem here is that, we're almost 4 years into this war.
Pushing for in February.
Yeah, and, we have years of mistakes and choices. So, kind of coming up with a simple bullet point on Ukraine at this point is pretty difficult. I think when the Russians invaded Ukraine, even though we had, as I say in my piece on preventive war, we had something to do with that. I think we still didn't want the Russians to succeed, right? Opting to invade other countries, even if you think you're doing it for defensive reasons, it still kind of starts a whole bunch of other balls rolling, and starts them rolling in the direction of the coalition of which we were still members, which is to say NATO. And you can't really know, even though I may think that the evidence is pretty strong that this was a somewhat rationally calculated preventive war. I could be wrong, and it could be that Putin is indeed the crazed nationalist imperialist that people who are, partisans of Ukraine would say, right? So you needed to kind of push back, right? The Ukrainians deserve some help. I think in the early months of the war, we provided that help. That help was largely defensive with a big D. We confined ourselves to defensive weapons. I think that was intelligent. After the front was stabilized, I think there were decisions to make, and we made the wrong ones, and so did Ukraine. We should have been trying to negotiate an end to that war in the first year. That required, making concessions that maybe we in Ukraine didn't really want to make from an emotional point of view or from a legitimacy point of view, but from the point of view of having a big war persist there at that time, you're spinning the roulette wheel on escalation every week. And you've seen what's followed predictably. There's a never-ending series of requests for Ukraine for ever more lethal weapons, ever greater range. As different ideas about counteroffensives fail, people's fertile imaginations come up with new ones. We're now back to like 1930s strategic bombing theory that if the Ukrainians could only find the panacea targets in Russia, these would press these buttons, the Russians will suddenly come to their senses. None of this seems very likely to me. And all of it, you're spinning the roulette wheel every time you do it, right? So we had one, everyone agrees there was a kind of a near nuclear kind of crisis in the fall of 22. And do you really want another of those? Do you want to keep betting you can successfully navigate them? So people should be trying to find a way to ratchet this thing down. And my view, and, I like to say jokingly about myself that I become a big chicken, right? I don't really want to see what attacks on the Russian petroleum industry elicit. I think we should continue to constrain our provision of weapons to Ukraine and exert influence about what they do and do not shoot at, what they do and do not try. And, I think President Trump's instincts to try and move towards diplomacy are right. it's just very hard right now to find some area of agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians. Putin is filling his oats. He's got the usual tyranny of sunk costs. And, finding a diplomatic outcome here is not something that the president can do with a few weeks of activity. It's a project. And he's got to put people on it, and they have to have a theory. And I don't think he really has people on it. He doesn't really have a theory. So I think we're just left feeding the meter here, but at least we should do what we can to minimize the risks of a bigger explosion.
Wonderful. Well, I would be remiss not to ask about China, perhaps as our final question, because I want to respect the time you've already given us. But what does restraint mean for U.S. strategy towards China? What role should we play in deterring a more aggressive China moving forward?
Well, I'm not, and once upon a time, I was sort of one of the handful of people celebrating about restraint. There's now many people, including people who are actual experts on Chinese foreign policy, not just and defense policy, from the inside out and the outside in. So you should really ask them. I don't pretend to have any great wisdom about China. I don't think restraint has a single answer. I think different people who have restraint instincts may come up with different answers. Right? China is a very great power now. Whether it's as great as we are in every dimension, I don't think matters. It's great enough that we have to think of it as another pole in the system, right? And it's clear that they have ambitions. The extent of those ambitions are not known, right? Their style of diplomacy has become kind of truculent and abrasive. They're building up their military power. Restrainers have never been against power balancing abroad. They're not against every activity abroad. The driving idea in restraint is that you calculate your interests, and we do have an interest in some loose containment of Chinese power. I think that's correct. The problem is, within that vague statement, there's a whole lot of different, possibilities, right? Including the all-in, alliance of democracies against the authoritarian menace, which I think is kind of way off to the right of or left, or whatever you want to say, what any restrainer would advocate. To this offshore balancing idea, basically a chain of states, mostly maritime states with linked interests, to some mutual adjustment with China that basically says you are a great power, you're entitled to have some interest in this area, but so are we, and to work through some place where those interests, where there's a gray area between our interests and theirs, and we have a bit of a live and let live strategy. So my view is that, we should be trying to balance Chinese power, but we should be cognizant of some of their red lines, right? We shouldn't acknowledge every one, but I take seriously the strategic and ideological reasons for their interest in Taiwan, and I think those who organized the opening to China developed a compromise that we should stick with religiously, which is, we accept the idea of one China, and we believe that should be realized peaceably in the fullness of time. And that means never, ever approving or showing that we approve in any way, shape, or form any Taiwanese effort to move towards formal independence. And we've already screwed that up, but we should return to that policy. It may be too late, right? It may be too late, right? And then the question is, if China decides to rectify this problem by force, are you going to fight, and how are you going to fight? And I think that's a thing we have to debate. I have friends who are not necessarily restrainers, who nevertheless believe fighting for Taiwan's a bad idea. The nuclear risks are too great. I think we've got a problem, is that our other allies in Asia sort of expect us to fight for Taiwan in some way, and we've stuck our necks so far out that we're a bit stuck. But if that's the case, then we should think about how we're going to fight for Taiwan. And I would say, very carefully, right? So don't expect, if you're going to fight for Taiwan, don't expect a decisive victory. You have to accept the fact that war is going to end ugly with a diplomatic solution, right? And if you're not ready to do that, then you really have to step back one second and say, are you willing to fight a nuclear war over Taiwan? I'm not. Some people may be.
Wonderful. Well, go ahead, George.
No, I was just saying fascinating analysis. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, and Professor Posen, you've generously given us more than 30 minutes of your time. Thank you for joining us. Where can our listeners continue to follow your analysis and your work?
Well, I've been trying to, I tend to do a kind of a compromise between long-form journalism and short-form scholarship these days. And one of the things I try and do now is anything I write, I try and make sure it's published open access, right? So if you go to the MIT Security Studies Posen program website, you'll see allusions to my stuff as it comes up. Occasionally I do a podcast like this. You can find my stuff by just doing a simple Google search and seeing what, ask about issues, Europe, Ukraine, U.S. foreign policy. And you'll find stuff of varying lengths. And I appreciate anyone who has the patience to wade through my ruminations.
Your ruminations have shaped policy for a generation. Thank you again, and we look forward to having you on in the future. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.